Hello, my name is Gevorg Melikian. I am a policy analyst and host of this show. Please join me in welcoming Tom de Waal from London. Tom, hello. I hope you are doing well. You are in Armenia.
Yeah.
Let me introduce you to our audience. Tom is a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe in London, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. Before going back to London, Tom was a senior associate in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., specializing primarily in the South Caucasus region. He is the author of a number of publications about the region. His latest book is titled Great Catastrophe: Armenians and Turks in the Shadow of Genocide. Tom is also the author of a very famous book on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict called Black Garden, Sevagi, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War, which has been translated into Armenian, Azeri, Russian, and Turkish. Tom has worked as a journalist for the Moscow Times, the Times of London, and The Economist, specializing in Russian politics and the situation in Chechnya. He has also worked for the BBC and for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting in London. So I'm really thankful, Tom, for being with us and for having accepted my invitation. So let's first of all see why you are in Armenia. How long you have not been in Armenia?
I've not been here for a few years, so I'm glad of an opportunity to be here. I'm here invited by the Caucasus Institute, who have a conference on the Karabakh conflict, funded, I think, by the British Embassy here in Yerevan, and there's a good group of specialists here from around the world to discuss the conflict.
So you will be doing a presentation speech during the conference, and it's focused on the international perspective on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I don't know if it's all about the likelihood of war or likelihood of peace. So what will you be talking about?
Well, I was asked to choose a topic. For me, this is an interesting topic. And I suppose I wanted to say, I think there's a perception here in the region, often both in Armenia and in Azerbaijan and in Karabakh, that the world is paying attention to this conflict, that it's an important issue, and also that the conflict is often driven by international factors. I don't...
More geopolitical.
Geopolitical factors. I don't really share that view. To me, this is primarily a local conflict, and the international geopolitical factors are secondary. I think obviously Russia plays a role, but I would argue that Russia's role is also less important than the role played by Baku and Yerevan. And I think Russia tries to play a balancing role, but in my view...
You mean against both sides?
Yeah, with and against both sides, but I think that balancing role means that Russia is also not popular either on the Armenian side or the Azerbaijani side. So I'm interested in why there are different international actors who should have a great interest in this conflict, but do not seem to do so.
But on the other hand, there is an opinion that this conflict is very much politicized and geopoliticized, and there are many factors influencing the outcome. That's why it's too difficult to appease all actors and to please all actors. That's why also the conflict is in its status quo situation and it's not going forward. You don't share this vision?
Well, I think there's a certain equilibrium in the conflict, a certain balance of forces between Armenian side and Azerbaijani side. I think what distinguishes this conflict from the other post-Soviet conflicts is that in the others there's always been one non-recognized or partially recognized territory against a big sovereign state. So starting in the 90s, it was Chechnya against Moscow, South Ossetia and Abkhazia against Tbilisi, Transnistria against Moldova, and so there was an imbalance there. Here we have a balance of two more or less equal forces, one centered Karabakh Armenians plus Yerevan and against Baku. So I think this provides for a certain equilibrium. It also means that the status issue is much less clear in this conflict. I think in all the other conflicts, there was a strong emphasis on the territorial integrity of Russia, Georgia, Moldova, now Ukraine, of course. Here, there is much less, because of this equilibrium, because Baku against Yerevan, there is much less clarity about the status issue. People, no one, I think, can agree what the final status of Karabakh will be, and I agree this prolongs the conflict, prolongs the status quo. But these are, I think, more inner forces than outward forces. I think the outward forces are reflecting this equilibrium in the Caucasus between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. I don't think one single outer external player has a very strong interest in doing something now for the Karabakh conflict.
Why you think happened what happened in 2016 in April, like exactly about 2 years ago?
Mm-hmm. I think there was a certain inevitability about that small conflict, just because a few factors. The heavy militarization of the ceasefire line. I think when the ceasefire was signed in 1994, there was a few lightly armed conscript soldiers in trenches, taking a few shots from time to time at one another. No one. It was not a heavily armed, dangerous conflict. Now you have the same geography, the same ceasefire line, but you have heavy militarization, which means that the margin of error is very small. And so, you had a helicopter being shot down previously. You have these drones, heavy artillery, aviation, helicopters, mortars. All these heavy weaponry means that I think the prospect for quick escalation is much bigger than it was before, and still is. So this gives, I think, more power to the commanders on the ground to make decisions. I think that's one factor. Second factor is, I think, in Azerbaijan, the rhetoric has been very, very high for
all the time. It was very
ever since the end of the war.
Militaristic.
Ever since the end of the war, Azerbaijan has been a traumatized country. We've lost our territory unjustly to Armenian occupation, and therefore we must, at some point, But it's just the rhetoric to create, for example, the context in which Azerbaijan could freely behave in a way it wants. You don't think so? Well, I think in a way the rhetoric, initially at least, was a compensation for doing nothing. That when Haydar Aliyev and then Ilham Aliyev had this particularly, less so Haydar Aliyev, but more, this strong rhetoric was a compensation for the fact I'm doing nothing, but I'm speaking loudly and aggressively. The trouble with that is that words, they raise the temperature in the country, they raise aggressive feelings, particularly amongst young people who maybe never met an Armenian. And so I think that also created a kind of background against which it was much easier to start a conflict. And I guess we recall 2016 was 2015, 2016 were difficult economic times in Azerbaijan. So that was also another reason, I think, why it was easier to talk about the Karabakh conflict than talk about domestic problems.
Tom, here in Armenia, we hear a lot that people, experts and politicians are complaining that the OSCE Minsk group or international community in general is not making targeted statements against Azerbaijan, not condemning what Azerbaijan is doing. Do you really think that it is because they don't see that Azerbaijan is violating, or they just don't want to take sides, or they don't care at all what is happening there? What is the reason, and how the Armenian side should be vis-a-vis the international community?
Well, I think there's a few problems here. One is that the OSCE Minsk group has a very limited presence on the ground. As you know, only 6 monitors. Maybe that will increase to maybe 12 or 13, but even that is very, very small. So they do not have the eyes and ears to understand every incident. Maybe they can look at satellite pictures or so on, but they do not have the absolute certainty to know what lies behind every incident, to speak with authority. Plus they're diplomats. Diplomats are necessarily cautious. Occasionally you read these statements that they make, and they refer to specific geographical points, and you understand there is a subtext there, but they don't say it very loudly. It's also a consensus organizations, 3 countries, which means that they share the burden of responsibility, and that makes them more cautious as well. So I think certainly I think there is frustration that there's a belief here that Azerbaijan is usually the side that breaks the ceasefire, usually but not always, and that they would prefer the Minsk group to speak more loudly on that. And I can understand that frustration, but the way that operation is constructed, I think you're not going to unfortunately see much change in that. In general, I would like to see a much more public diplomacy by mediators. In other peace processes, the mediators speak much more to the public. They speak, and they also talk about the benefits of peace. Basically, one problem with this conflict is that you have a kind of national Armenian narrative, which we know well, a national Azerbaijani narrative we know well, and no one's speaking a third narrative, which is about the benefits of peace, about coexistence.
I am an Armenian. You know that, as I told you. Of course, I can't know what Armenians are doing, but I cannot know what Azeris are doing and willing to do. And here in Armenia, based on not only the perception that we have, but also based on the actions that we see, for example, 2016, we don't see that the Azeri side is trying, at least trying, to get a peaceful solution. You cannot attack and kill someone and tell the guy that, I want peace with you. So there is something wrong going on here.
I mean, I'm sure, I think a lot of people in Azerbaijan don't want peace. They want victory. And there's a frustration, obviously, in Azerbaijan. And I think it's important to remember that, this dispute started with the NKO, the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region, in 1988, with its Armenian majority. But it ended, of course, in 1994 with all these other territories which were never part of the original dispute, Agdam, Fizuli, Zangalan, etc., Kalbajar, being controlled by under the Armenian control. I think that is the biggest source of frustration in Azerbaijan.
But you know that the Armenian side sometimes, and very often or less often, says that we can do some concessions, and it's all about also these lands, which creates also a tension inside of the society, because the society is not ready for concessions.
I think, I think that I've talked about this issue as a security dilemma. On the one hand, the return of these territories is, Azerbaijan will not sleep, will continue to be aggressive until these territories returned. On the other hand, the Armenians keep these territories as a security buffer zone to defend their own security, and this heavy aggressive emphasis on security on both sides creates an insecurity which perpetuates the conflict. So I think this is the essential problem, or security dilemma is another way of putting it.
Well, it's a security dilemma, of course, and it's very difficult to face a security dilemma and to see that, for example, you can be attacked, and the international community is not very responsive to that. So what Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh has to do? Should Armenia push the independence issue of Nagorno-Karabakh internationally? You know that they are making some steps. Or should Armenia recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh? Or should it unify with Nagorno-Karabakh? Or to find probably with Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan doesn't want to make any steps toward Armenia, and they are putting some preconditions. So do you really see here what would be the best solution?
Well, I think, first of all, just any steps, I think, towards recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh, I think could be quite risky because they would probably kill the Minsk process. And maybe people don't like the Minsk process, but it's the only diplomatic process there is. It's a mechanism which keeps the international community, in the conflict. Mm-hmm. I think that would be destroyed by Armenian recognition of Karabakh, which would basically mean that that Yerevan stops taking. It says that statement basically means we are no longer the interlocutor. This is not negotiations between Baku and Yerevan. This becomes negotiations between Baku and Stepanakert. So I think that would be dangerous. I think the problem it would certainly be desirable to have greater international involvement in this conflict. But again, because of this equilibrium, greater international involvement means putting pressure on Baku and Yerevan to make concessions with each other. And then now, two fully functioning sovereign states, and no one really wants to do that. In Moscow, I see that, the Putin administration values its bilateral relations with Baku, values its bilateral relations with Yerevan. It sees no positive benefits in putting pressure on them to deal with one another. And the same is true in Iran, in EU, in America.
Tom, when you say that if Armenia recognizes the independence, it will stop or will create more tension, you don't think that Azerbaijan is aware of that? That's why it is abusing Armenia's, let's say, patience or this strategy?
I think both sides do everything they can to annoy, to abuse, to frustrate the other side. But I still think the frustration, of course, is bigger on the Azerbaijani side because they lost the war of the 1990s. They lost territory. They have larger number of refugees.
They are not teenagers to be consolated by, okay, they have problems. Let's consolate them. Okay, and the problem is that if they are not happy with the outcome, that they created the system that we are in, unfortunately. Why they don't want to be more constructive, more positive toward the peaceful solution?
This is they're still in a post-war mental situation. Now you could say they should have done more to move on from that situation, but it's hard. It's also, as we know, an instrument of domestic politics in both. In Armenia and in Azerbaijan, the conflict. So, it's easier to use the conflict to complain about the conflict than to do something constructive about it. So unfortunately, until we see a kind of strategic rethink, which has to happen, together with international support, I think the status quo, or worse than the status quo, will continue.
Tom, you are visiting sometimes Baku and Yerevan, and you see some changes in both cities and countries as well. Here in Armenia, we are afraid or concerned, worried about the rising level of Armenophobia in Azerbaijan. Why so? Is it again a sort of policy, or it's natural that they do that, or it's something that existed before, but we just see it in more, let's say, emphasized way?
Well, I think it's on the one hand, again, it's national, it's natural, national and natural. It's a product of this frustration with 25 years of loss. It's a national ideology. It's useful to have an enemy, and Armenia is the enemy. It's also, I think, some of it is performance rather than reality. I think you talk to the same person in public, they make these very aggressive, anti-Armenian statements, and then you sit down with them and have a private conversation, and they have a very different view, and even say, you know, by the way, my grandmother was Armenian. So,
wow.
so you know, not being there in Azerbaijan, talking to people quietly, you don't get the full picture.
I want to know if you see, because this question is asked to all experts and to all politicians, do you see the likelihood of war again, or the escalation on the front line?
I mean, I think the most likely, every day, the most likely situation is the status quo, this situation of no war, no peace, I think is, but of course, every year that goes by, the risk of some kind of conflict increases. And I think the danger here is that a small incident is no longer a small incident. A small incident can lead to
can trigger
an escalation, and even 2 or 3 days of fighting is a small war here, as we saw in April 2016, where maybe 200 people died. So even the likelihood of a big war is still, you know, fortunately quite small. I think, unfortunately, the likelihood of a repeat of April 2016, unfortunately, is quite high.
Tom, and my last question. You are the author of this famous book, Black Garden, which was highly debated in a positive and negative way. You have been criticized a lot from both sides, in Azerbaijan and in Armenia. What would you change if you would rewrite the book? And did the book serve the purpose you wrote the book?
I think the book served the purposes in that I wanted to kind of get a kind of baseline of what happened, particularly in the first phase of the conflict, how it started, and, you know, particularly in 1988 to the early period of the conflict. I think I achieved that by telling all the stories from both sides, and stories of Sumgait and in particular. So I think I wanted to tell a human story in which people heard the human voices from all sides. So I achieved that, and I wanted to tell us, you know, so I wanted to have a book of many voices, and I think I achieved that. I think people still read it. I still get positive letters, and no one really disputes the facts in the book. Maybe sometimes people dispute 1 or 2 things, and then, but they also don't have positive proof to disprove the things that I say. So I think the book has stood up well. Would I change anything? Well, I think the only thing to say is, you know, because there are certain people in the book who still are powerful people, I didn't want to, I maybe wrote a little more carefully about certain individuals than I would have done if I wanted to come back here. So my language maybe was a little diplomatic at times, but that's, you know, and it has enabled me to continue coming back to the region.
Tom, thank you very much for this conversation and your thoughtful answers. I hope you will visit Armenia again, and hopefully we will host you again on this show. Thank you very much.
Sure, okay, thank you.
Thank you for watching Paradigm Analytical Show. See you next time.